This evening, we're going to be talking about the evolution of Hanukkah. And Hanukkah is a holiday with which many Jewish people are familiar. In fact, Hanukkah is one of the two most observed Jewish holidays in the calendar. Now, for North American Jews, the two most observed Jewish holidays are Passover in the spring and Hanukkah in the winter. It's not a coincidence that those are the two most observed Jewish holidays because they are supported by the surrounding culture that has two major holidays in that season. Ironically, Hanukkah itself was historically a minor holiday in the rabbinic calendar. The major pilgrimage holidays of Passover and Sukkot in the fall and Shavuot in the summer were more important even when the temple stood. And the rabbinically emphasized high holidays of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur were also on a much higher plane. Even Shabbat, once a week, was taken more seriously than Hanukkah, because on Shabbat and on those other major holidays, you weren't allowed to do any work. Hanukkah, you light a few candles, not a big deal. You could go to work, you recited a few special prayers, you lit the candles, and there weren't a lot of rules around it. So Hanukkah was a minor holiday, but it's become a major holiday. So that means it's changed over the centuries. And we'll talk a little bit about how Hanukkah began and how it grew. So this is the Hanukkah we're familiar with. But by the end of this conversation, you may decide that we're looking at something very different. Is this Hanukkah? Well, it still has the lights, but it looks very different. And it's an example of the kind of creativity that comes into play when we see how people take a holiday, a cultural inheritance, and then create from it. I do want to say at the outset a sort of footnote for credit. A lot of these images for these slides come from a presentation that a colleague of mine, Rabbi Sivan Mas, who lives and works in Jerusalem, put together some years ago for a conference that we held together. And so I've borrowed some of these images and slides from her presentation there. So photo credit to her. So the first issue to deal with Hanukkah is that there may have been a Hanukkah before there was a Hanukkah. What does that mean? Well, we think of Hanukkah as the festival of lights. And we know that in many cultures, people recognized a long time ago that this is the time of year when the days get shorter and shorter and the nights get longer and longer. And it's what we call in modern astronomy the solstice, right? It's when we have the shortest possible day, just as the summer solstice is the longest possible day. And so many cultures developed festivals of light that would occur in this season. The Romans had the birth of the invincible sun. The Hindu holiday of Diwali takes place a little bit earlier, October, November, but certainly in this season of increasing darkness. And obviously the light of Hanukkah. But there may have even been a pre-Hanukkah winter festival of some kind, or simply an observance to mark the darkness. And the dating of Hanukkah actually clues us into the fact that this is as much a festival of darkness as it is a festival of light. Now, what you see on this map, on this calendar page, is the cycles of the moon from day 1 of a moon cycle to day 30 of the moon cycle. So from new moon all the way through full moon, and then down to no moon again at the end, just before the next new moon. Now, I bring this to you because Jewish months, you'll probably recall, work on the moon cycle. And so the 15th of the month, which is often a Jewish holiday, think of Purim, Passover, Tu B'Shvat, Sukkot, those all happen on the 15th of a Jewish month. That's going to be a full moon right in the middle of the month every time. And when you get to the end of the month, you're going to have almost no moon to no moon. Now, Hanukkah begins every year on the same day, the 25th of Kislev. It all depends on your calendar, right? In the Jewish calendar, it's always on the 25th of Kislev. And you can see, if you look at the 25th of the moon cycle, the moon is almost gone. And as you go through the next 8 days to the 26th, 27th, 28th, 29th, 30th, into the first second, you see there's almost no moon. So it's not just that this holiday is one of celebrating light, but it's also one during the darkest nights of the year. Now, why are these the darkest nights of the year? Because it's the end of the moon cycle closest to the winter solstice. So it's the longest, darkest nights that you can get, because it could be that the winter solstice is on a full moon. And then that's not going to be a dark night. You've got a full moon out there. Hanukkah really is scheduled to be during the darkest nights of the year. And so it's very suggestive, given that the Jewish calendar begins days at night. Remember, all the holidays begin at night, the Seder's at night. Well, maybe they wanted to have a holiday, or they had a holiday celebrating light during those darkest nights when the moon was most gone. We don't have a lot of direct evidence for this. We have a couple of anecdotal pieces we'll see in a minute, but it is suggestive that this is a festival of darkness. So why do we celebrate Hanukkah? Now, this is the story that we get from history using the books of Maccabees that they themselves wrote. And given that, pre-modern history was not really academic history as we think of it, we have to take it with a little grain of salt. After all, the Maccabees are writing it themselves, so they're going to make themselves look good, but it's still a useful background. It describes that there were people from Israel who wanted to make a covenant with the Greeks around them, and so they were willing to do the things the Greeks did, including exercising in Jerusalem in a gymnasium, which also meant naked, by the way, making themselves uncircumcised, forsaking the Holy Covenant, and so on. So it's actually Jews themselves, Hebrews themselves, who are open to the influence of Greek culture. Now, some years later, a king of the Syrian Greek Empire, the so-called Seleucid Empire, decided to impose rules on the people. But notice, even though he imposed these rules, many Israelites consented to his religion, sacrificed to idols, profaned the Sabbath. So some Jews were okay with it, unlike what we think of as the Maccabean story. Now, on the 15th day of the month of we would say Kislev, Kaslu is how it's pronounced in Greek, in which the book of the Maccabees is written, in the 145th year of that Seleucid Empire, they set up the abomination of desolation upon the altar and built idol altars throughout the cities of Judah on every side, burnt incense at the door, and they tore in pieces the books of the law, the Torah scrolls that they found. They burnt them with fire. So here this is directly a religious persecution, and it's happening specifically in the month of Kislev, the same month of the close to the winter solstice. And they highlight in this story, on the 25th of the month was when they sacrificed upon the idol altar. They set it up on the 15th, and they sacrificed it on the 25th of Kislev. Remember the date of Hanukkah? It's the 25th of Kislev, the same date as the desecration of the altar. You might as well call Hanukkah Desecration Day, because that's when that date is first marked. Now, Mattathias, who is the sort of patriarch of the Maccabees, and his sons tear their clothes, and they are in deep mourning. Some people encourage him to speak up. In fact, the king's officers ask him to come and do these sacrifices with them. And then came forward one of the Jews in the sight of all to sacrifice on the altar. Mattathias saw this. He was inflamed with zeal, and he could not withhold his anger, and he slew the Jew who was willing to sacrifice upon the altar, and also killed the king's commissioner, just like the story of Pinchas in the Torah, who kills a Jew and a Midianite who are cohabiting in the temple, in the Ark sanctuary. So here you have the first casualty of the Maccabean revolt is a Jewish person who's participating in Hellenistic culture. He cried, "Whoever is zealous for the law, come with me." And so they went around and they pulled down altars. Whatever children they found within the coast of Israel uncircumcised, they circumcised them. They didn't ask them. But they're imposing now their version of Judaism on everybody. Eventually, they've conquered Jerusalem, and they took new stones to build a new altar. They make up the sanctuary and all the things in the temple, new holy vessels. Into the temple, they brought the candlestick. Now, the word in Hebrew, menorah, has the word ner, candle, in it. So a candlestick or candelabra is a direct translation for menorah. And the altar of burnt offerings and so on. And they burnt incense, and the lamps on the candlestick they lit to give light in the temple. They put loaves on the table and finished all the works they made. On the 25th day of the ninth month, which is called the month of Kislev, in the 148th year, this is around 162 BCE, by the way, they rose up in the morning, and they offered a sacrifice according to the law on burnt offerings, On the day and time the heathen had profaned it, even in that it was dedicated with songs. And so why do we celebrate Hanukkah on the 25th of Kislev? Because it was Desecration Day that they replaced with Dedication Day. And dedication in Hebrew is Chanukah. So that's where Hanukkah, the name, comes from, but it's also the festival coming from the desecration, not only from the celebration. And you'll notice something else about this story. They lit the lamps. There was great gladness among the people. Judah and his brethren and the whole congregation of Israel ordained that the dedication of the altar should be kept in their season from year to year in the space of 8 days from the 25th of the month of Kislev with mirth and gladness. But it doesn't say why 8 days, because this version of the story has no mention of any miracle of the lights. They lit the lamp, no discussion of any problem with oil, and voila. So why 8 days? Well, for that, we have to dig a little bit deeper. Now, one other point about the date of the 25th of Kislev. This is speculation, but it's sort of fun, so it's worth sharing. I had a professor in our rabbinic program at the International Institute who suggested that the 25th of this month for one of the Seleucid kings was actually the king's birthday. And so it may well be that we are still celebrating the birthday of an Antiochian or Seleucid king. The names of the kings alternated: Seleucus Antiochus. So one of them, we might be still celebrating his birthday and lighting candles for it, of all things. But that's been lost to history. We're not sure that that's the real reason. So the option one reason, the first and most prominent reason of why we celebrate Hanukkah, is the dedication of the temple. You can see in this relief from the Arch of Titus, which is in Rome, a depiction of the menorah that stood in Jerusalem. And again, you'll notice it doesn't have the 4 + 4 + 1 that you have in the Hanukkah menorah that we see today. It has the 7 lights of the 7 days of the week, just like the menorah we light here at Kol Hadash. And this was the menorah that the Maccabees lit. Of course, would it have made sense for the Maccabees to light one with 8 lights and one? No, because the story hadn't happened yet. Just like it didn't make sense for them to play with dreidels before, if you ever heard that story in your Sunday school. That's also not historical. So the first rationale for this is a dedication, and this might help explain why 8 days, because the first temple dedication described in the book of Kings, chapter 8, first book of Kings, chapter 8, under Solomon, he holds a dedication festival when the first temple is built. And how long is that? Well, he held the feast 7 days, 7 more days, 14 days, but on the 8th day, he sent the people away. So really, it was an 8th-day public festival. So maybe as they're rededicating the temple under the Maccabees, they wanted to reenact the dedication under Solomon, and they made it an 8-day festival. Now, why should you assume there's only one version? It turns out there's a second book of Maccabees that retells the story, but with a different rationale for why celebrate the holiday. Now, this agrees with first Maccabees that on the same day the sanctuary was profaned, on that very day, the cleansing of the sanctuary was completed, the 25th of the month of Kislev. So they replaced this desecration with holiness again. And they kept 8 days with joy in the manner of the holiday of Sukkot, remembering how just recently during Sukkot, they were wandering in the mountains and the caves like wild beasts. So carrying branches wrapped with leaves and fair boughs and palms, they offered up psalms and songs of thanksgiving. So they're marking 8 days because it reminds them of Sukkot, including with the lulav, right? And branches. So that's an alternative. That could have been the way Hanukkah was celebrated in the early years of the Maccabees. But it also gives you an alternate rationale for 8 days. And their rationale for 8 days is because it's like Sukkot. So you'll notice this decoration of a menorah where you'd have one center light with a big wick here, and you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 wicks coming out of the shared oil pool in this lamp, but the decorations are sheaves of plants. And so the holiday of Sukkot, as it's described in Leviticus, is also 8 days. You have 7 days of fire sacrifice, and the 8th day is like a closing day with a special assembly. So Sukkot itself is a 7 + 1 or an 8-day holiday, and maybe that's why Hanukkah is 8 days. Now, the third option comes from a historian named Josephus, who's writing about, let's say, 200 years after the Maccabees. And notice, both First Maccabees and Second Maccabees didn't mention a miracle of the light, and neither does Josephus, who's writing, again, much closer to the events than we are. And he describes, again, on the 25th day, they lit the light of the menorah. It happened on the same day when divine worship had been stopped before. And it says here again, Judah celebrated the festival of restoring sacrifices for 8 days. I'll point out one other thing. If the legend of the oil was true, why would they have the first celebration be 8 days? Wouldn't the first celebration be 1 day? And then they realize it goes on? In this case, it's 8 days because it's drawing on something else. He declares it at the beginning for 8 days, and they were so happy to celebrate this, they decided to make it a festival forever. And from that time to this, we celebrate this festival and call it lights, in Hebrew, nerot, like from ner in menorah. And Josephus guesses, according to his writing, I suppose the reason was because this liberty beyond our hopes appeared to us, and hence was the name given to the festival. Now, calling this holiday lights and having it scheduled at this time of year, well, that suggests that maybe there was this pre-existing solstice or darkest nights of the year celebration that the Maccabees are simply glomming onto or reclaiming in some way. It might not have been date specific to the 25th, and that has to do with the Maccabean persecution, but it may have been there was a fire festival that the Maccabees decided that they could co-opt for their purposes. So this is that concept that maybe there was a pre-existing holiday called lights attached to the season of the year. And it's not an accident that many other cultures mark celebrations of light in the darkness, even if it's non-sectarian lights like this you'll see in many towns. It's just dark out. It's nice to have a little bit more light. And there's even a suggestion in a rabbinic source that hints at this universal practice. It imagines that the first Adam, not me, but the first Adam in Genesis, after he's been kicked out of the garden. Remember, that's if Rosh Hashanah is in the fall. Now we're getting to winter a couple months later out there in the real world, and the days are getting shorter and the days are getting shorter. And so maybe Adam speculates when God said, you will die from eating from the tree, this is what he meant. The sun's going to go out. And so he started an 8 days fast. But as he observed the winter equinox, and he saw the day getting longer and longer, he said, oh, this is the way the world works. And so he took the 8 days fast and made it into an 8 days festival. Now, is this sort of a mythological origin for the Maccabean observance or for the lights festival that came before? Maybe so, but it's recognizing that this is a universal phenomenon, and maybe there were other cultures in the area that we don't have records of that also celebrated some kind of winter solstice event with lighting lights. So this is the origin of the holiday. Again, notice in First Maccabees and Second Maccabees, in Josephus, no mention of the lights. It isn't until the Babylonian Talmud compiled this text probably around 400 of the Common Era, finalized by 550, let's say, of the Common Era, where we finally get the story of the miracle of the lights. Because the Talmud asks, what's the reason of Hanukkah? And here's the answer they get. For when the Greeks entered the temple, they defiled all the oils. And when the Hasmoneans defeated them, they found only one container of oil with the seal of the high priest, but which held enough only for 1 day's light. But a miracle happened. The famous Nes Gadol, right? A famous miracle happened, and they lit the menorah with it for 8 days. And the next year, these days were made into a holiday with reciting prayers and Thanksgiving and so on. So this is the story that many people learn, not in our Sunday school, but many people learn in Sunday school. Actually, our kids learn it too. They just know it's a story and not the real history. This is the other reason, is the idea of the miracle of the lights. And from that, the rabbis developed all sorts of laws about what the shape of a menorah should be, the fact that the 8 lights should be on one level, with the shamus light, the extra light used to light the rest of them, being at a different level. It could be lower, it could be higher, it could be set apart, but it shouldn't be part of the 8 to be confused. The rule to put it in a public place so it's displayable, and all kinds of other rules. We'll look at a few of those in a little bit. But this is the rabbinic version of Hanukkah about the miracle of the lights. That's the classic version of the story. It's even used as the explanation for the letters on the dreidel game, that Nes Gadol Haya Sham, a great miracle happened there. Although even the dreidel has its own evolution. Most likely the dreidel was a medieval German top game where the 4 letters in Latin alphabet were N, G, H, and S. We found tops like that. And that stood for Nicht Ganze, halb, and Stellein. Nicht means nothing. You get nothing when you spin it. Ganze means the whole thing. Halb is half. And Shin or S is Stellein, to put one in. And so most likely it was a Yiddish dreidel that had the rules for the game. And later on, someone came up with the Hebrew phrase of a great miracle happened there to match the rabbinic story. Now, we also understand that Hanukkah has become more important in recent years because of the Jewish experience. And the Jewish experience, we've lived among Christian cultures for a long time, right? There have been Jews in Christian Europe since before there were Christians in Europe. But we didn't really care what our neighbors were doing or what their kids were getting or what was happening around us until the last couple hundred years, when Jews became citizens of their surrounding cultures and became acculturated into the surrounding communities with language and schools and all the other pieces that connect us to our non-Jewish neighbors, or even to our family who are not Jewish, as Jews are able now to marry non-Jewish people and have both cultures as part of their home. Well, the fact that Jews are now dealing with this cultural competition, so to speak, means that, first of all, Hanukkah becomes elevated in response to Christmas, and even Christmas got taken over by Madison Avenue and made even more of a shindig than it used to be in many cultures. But regardless, Jews tried to keep up. There's the increase of giving of gifts. 8 nights of presents becomes a selling point. And of course, the competition of Christmas has led to Hanukkah's elevation in recent years. But we today, celebrating Hanukkah, have also had it re-enlivened for another reason. Remember those stories of the Maccabees? They were inspirational to the early Zionists who wanted to build a Jewish state. In fact, the last long-term independent Jewish state, aside from a short rebellion, was the Maccabean state. In fact, you can still find coins around, and it reminds you of that sovereignty that Jews had and the fighting Maccabees who fought back. And so a lot of the early Zionist pioneers were interested in drawing on the Hasmoneans and the Maccabees as models for them. In fact, the most famous basketball team in Israel is Maccabi Tel Aviv. Or you may have heard of an event called the Jewish Olympics, also known as the Maccabi Games. Of course, the irony is that what was one of the major objections that the Hasmoneans and the Maccabees had to the Greeks was the Greek gymnasium and the Olympics, right? So the fact that the Jewish Olympics is called the Maccabi Games, the Maccabees might have hated that. But again, it's part of that competition with the surrounding world. But it's also an example of how Zionism helped to re-enliven the original Maccabean Hanukkah, not just the rabbinic one about the miracle of the lights, which to some extent was told to minimize the power of the Maccabees. Instead, now the real Maccabees come to the fore, and Hanukkah becomes even more important in the restored kingdom of Israel, or state of Israel, as we would say today. So that has also elevated Hanukkah in importance in the last couple hundred years, not only the competition with Christmas, but also the arrival of the modern day Maccabees, so to speak, in the land of Israel. And the last reason why many people celebrate Hanukkah is that they have warm and positive memories of celebrating Hanukkah, because there are special foods attached to it, and they differ in different cultures. In some cultures, they're generally fried in oil, which makes just about anything better, to be honest. In Eastern Europe, it was fried latkes, although I'll point out that there must have been latkes before the potato made it to Europe. But think, what would Eastern European Jews have done before the New World was discovered and the potato was brought back to Europe? They must have had something, maybe leeks, maybe some other bases, but certainly the potato latke has become a staple of Eastern European Hanukkah food. But there's also the sufganiyah, the jelly donut that's done in Sephardic Jewish communities. In Morocco, they have a kind of fried donut that they eat in this season. And so oiled foods, good foods, is certainly an attraction. But there's also the positive memories of lighting lights with family. You see examples of the food depicted here, the playing of the dreidel game, the giving of gelt, either the chocolate version, and again, this is chocolate wrapped in sort of gold foil to make it look like money, or to use that to play your dreidel games. It's just simply an experience of positive memories that many Jewish families have, or that can be made as new memories with the new families or people who joined the Jewish family. So the positive experiences are a warm reason to celebrate, whatever the original background to the story is. So why do we celebrate Hanukkah? Well, we talked about the dedication of the temple as the Maccabees reenacted an eighth-day dedication ceremony. It could be the story of Sukkot and remembering the Maccabean victory as a reflection of that moment of liberation. You have the Josephus story of lights, but also the phenomenon of the darkest night and the need for light near the solstice. You have the rabbinic story of the miracle of the oil, and then you have two sides of the Jewish experience, the desire for loot or presents and for competition, and the positive experiences of family and food and memories. And you can even take the negative side and make it positive. So two things that we've worked on in our household with moderate success. One is that we want to teach our family how to receive gifts appropriately. Writing thank you notes, being gracious, even if it's not the thing you wanted necessarily, but how to receive gifts is an important skill. And also how to give gifts and to be generous. So we think, we focus on the getting a lot, but maybe we could focus more on the giving. And the last thing we've tried to do in our community, in our family, and also in our congregation, is to help people be sensitive to the importance of giving to the community around them and not just to themselves. In fact, in some Jewish communities in Israel, I know, children are given money on the holiday, but money to give to tzedakah, to give to charity work. And so we actually have one night of the Hanukkah 8 that we designate as our charity night, where we look through and choose some charities and make some donations. There's even one that we like to give to called Kiva, which is a micro loan organization. And so we call it Hanukkah on the night that we make our donation there. So there are all kinds of new creative ways you can observe the holiday and make the ceremony meaningful and memorable. It doesn't have to only be the old-fashioned ways to do it. So when you hear rabbinic rules for how to celebrate, don't feel like there's only one way to do it. Even in the Talmud, there's more than one way to do it. So who gets to light? Well, one version says you could have one light each night per household, or one per member of the household. You could even vary it up and sometimes light one together and sometimes light one separately. Growing up, I think we only had one menorah that we lit for the whole family, but now we each have our own menorah and we get to light it ourselves. We can't even begin on how to begin lighting candles. The House of Hillel said you should start with 1 and add 2 and 3. And the House of Shammai said you should start with 8 and 7 and 6. And they have reasons for why they suggest those numbers. So on the same night, this would be the fourth night, you could have a differing number of candles, depending on whether you follow the House of Hillel or the House of Shammai, and which order you would light them. Who gets to light it? Again, a variety of traditions. And there are plenty of public menorah lightings. In fact, I understand that this Sunday is going to be the first menorah lighting during an NFL football game, because it happens to be during that. And of course, the Chabad nearby is setting up a big menorah, and they'll do a Hanukkah candle lighting as part of the NFL game. It also depends on where you are, because the style of menorah, look at how different all these menorahs are. Many of these are actually displayed at the Israel Museum in Jerusalem, which we'll have a chance to see on that Israel trip if you do join us. They're all different designs, and many of the designs are influenced by the cultural context in which Jews have been celebrating. So here's an example where a menorah from the south of France seems to reflect some elements of the major cathedral in Chartres. And you can see that circular motif reflected in the menorah design. Here's one that seems to evoke the wooden synagogue in Norovola, which unfortunately that end date of 1939, we know why it's gone. But you can see a menorah that seems to reflect some of the ethos of that building. Here's another one where you compare an Algerian menorah to a Tunisian architecture example, and you see the same sort of archways and the same kind of decorative elements around them. These would actually have been lit with little vials of oil put into the niches there in the menorah, and the shamas might have appeared at the upper niche. Here's another one reflecting this archway style in Venice that shows up in a menorah in Algeria. And of course, there's no reason you have to stick to old designs. So you could have the wine cork menorah, the Noah's Ark menorah, the one on the bottom right, I've heard called Menorahsaurus Rex, just to be fun, or the banana, I've never tried, but I imagine it might work. And here are some other designs. You've got Lego, you've got floral designs, you've got chess pieces, And you've got this wonderful sort of avant-garde modernist style of menorah as well. There's no one way to do it. And that's the truth of Hanukkah today, is that you could light different things. You could have, in fact, the candles be the menorah, as is in this, what's called a Chanukkit. You could light oil to go back to the original. You could just light the matches, in theory, if you've got something safe. And there used to be an app put out by the Jewish Museum in New York called Light My Fire, where you could choose any one of the antique menorahs they had in their collection and use that to virtually light the candle for yourself. So Hanukkah has evolved tremendously over the centuries that we've been celebrating it, and Jews have been being creative. After all, we think of tradition as standing still, but if there is a tradition in Jewish life, it's that tradition changes. So the more time has passed, the more Hanukkah has changed, and I think the more it will change going forward as well. So with that, I'm interested in your thoughts. Of those several reasons for celebrating Hanukkah, which ones are the most important for you? Or did you have any questions or comments or reactions to what we had to see?
Is it possible that some of it was also based on pagan tradition?
Oh, sure. I mean, the idea that there might have been a solstice candle lighting thing. Pagan just means pre our religion or outside of our religion. So yes, there might have been a pre or outside of mainstream Judaism observance of lighting candles. There might also have been a persistence of lighting candles despite what the establishment wanted. That we know that worshiping of idols continued long after the authorities in Jerusalem wanted to prescribe it and say it was forbidden. We know the Maccabees were not that liked by the rabbis. The rabbis de-emphasized the Maccabees. There's a reason why there isn't a separate section of the rabbinic laws focused on Hanukkah. It's thrown in as an aside in Shabbat, and it's thrown in as an aside in brachot and blessings, where they say, what's the blessing on Hanukkah? But they don't even have a separate section on Hanukkah with all the rules for the candles. That evolves later. And it's in commentaries on the original sources. So the rabbis didn't like Hanukkah at all because the Maccabees broke with rabbinic tradition in some ways and became Hellenized themselves. And the Maccabees start with great Jewish names like Judah and Mattatyahu, and they end up with names like Aristobulus and Hyrcanus and Alexander. And so they succumbed to Hellenism too. So the rabbis didn't like the Maccabees. They tried to de-emphasize it, but guess what? The people lit candles anyways, either because they liked the Maccabees or because they had this pre-existing pagan tradition that had been co-opted by the Maccabees and couldn't be let go. So this is one of those cases where there may well be pre-monotheistic Jewish roots to the ceremony, and we're continuing it. Again, it's not an accident. It's fire, it's dark. This is a human phenomenon. Sheila, please.
Well, I was just curious, we were talking about it, and this seems to be a Northern Hemisphere-centric holiday. So what do Jews in South America and in Australia do? Because obviously it's not the shortest day of the year.
Right.
How do you deal with it?
They like candles.
On the longest day of the year.
Yes. Look, you're absolutely right that this holiday evolved in the Northern Hemisphere, right? Jewish holidays are seasonal. Passover is tied to the spring, but it's the spring in the Northern Hemisphere. And, and the fall holiday of Sukkot, the fall harvest, it's not the fall harvest in Australia, okay? So these are Northern Hemisphere centric holidays. And I think the rationalization that people who do live in the Southern Hemisphere in Argentina and Australia give is this is the season that's happening in the land of Israel. We're observing the seasons there. Now, to be honest, we do that too, because Tu B'Shvat, the season of trees flowering, is usually in January or February. And in the Chicago area, there's no trees flowering unless you're in the botanic gardens, right? In the hothouse. So in the greenhouse. So we're also pulling the Israel seasons in the wrong climate. Same is true for Sukkot. In Israel, if you're there in October or late September and you want to build a temporary hut on your roof or on your patio in an apartment complex, it's wonderful. It's cool, it's temperate, it works great. If you're in Chicago and it's mid to late October and you're sitting out in your backyard trying to eat a meal in this temporary hut that you've built, it can be miserable. If you were in Eastern Poland or Northern Ukraine, I mean, it would have been terrible. So some of the climate stuff doesn't work. It's started in the land of Israel. It was evolved for that place. We're stuck with it as we move into other parts of the world. I mean, there are even debates about what do you do in Iceland, where the nights are so long and the days are short. What if you're on an orbiting spacecraft and it's a new day, all the time? Or how often do you put on your tefillin and take off your tefillin and say your prayers? And it would drive you crazy if you're trying to take this earthbound version and apply it to an orbiting existence. So the point is, you have to have a bit of a sense of humor about it, knowing that seasons are different. Judy.
Yeah, I have a question. Now, as far back as I can remember, we exchanged gifts for Hanukkah, even when I was a little girl. So somewhere between the time these stories were told with the Maccabees or whatever, and the 1940s and 50s, when I was a child, somebody came up with the idea that, hey, this is a holiday where we give presents for 8 days. Who came up with that? Was it store owners thought, gee, let's get the Jewish people to spend their money? Or was it a group of people? Or how did the present part?
So there was a tradition in Eastern Europe of giving little bits of gelt or little bits of money to kids each of the days. But it was not a big production. And it didn't really become a big production until Jews were living in a culture that made Christmas a big production. You need like a few factors. You need competition from the outside, and you need to care what your neighbors think. So if you were living in Eastern Europe and your neighbors hate you and you hate them, who cares what they're doing during their holiday? It didn't influence you. But once you're living in New York or in Illinois, outside of Chicago or in Chicago, and you see all this Christmas stuff going on, now the Jewish families begin to be influenced by this. I will also point out that there have been Jews, even Jewish partners, who celebrated Christmas in America because it was presented as the American holiday. They might have called it a Hanukkah bush. They might have hid it in the basement sometimes, but they celebrated Christmas too, especially Jews who came from German-speaking countries, because Christmas was a big deal in Germany, and many Jews just picked up a holiday tree and used it for that. In the former Soviet Union, actually, Jews have a New Year's tree. And many of the Russian Jews who've made their transition to Israel or elsewhere have what they call a New Year's tree, but it's just a repurposed Christmas tree. So there's a lot of this cross-cultural influence. We imagine Judaism lived in a bubble and didn't care what happened to anything around it, but the more open societies we lived in, the more we cared. And so in that period of, when the mass of Jews came to this country in the 1880s through the 1920s, they began to experience the world around them, and they began to make Hanukkah a more important holiday and a more gift-focused holiday. But I will say, Christmas also was not about huge mounds of gifts the way it is now until the retailers got their hands on it. So it definitely was a function of advertising and promotion to make it the gift avalanche that it's become. I mean, don't forget, it used to be that the gifts in the stockings were for Santa and the reindeer. Like you put, horse feed in the stockings so you could feed the reindeers. It wasn't about you getting stuff out of it. That's a later evolution in Christmas time. So it definitely is an influence of the outside world, encouraging Jews to do this, but also Jews wanting to compete with their neighbors and wanting to keep it interesting for their kids. And so that's really how it evolves. Yeah, Lori.
So you mentioned in another class about the fact that Maccabees 1 and 2 exist only in the Catholic Bible, in their canon, and not in the Jewish Bible. So when did suddenly this become the story that the rabbis at some point say, hey, we got these other two books, or what would?
Well, so here's what happened. The Maccabees wrote their books themselves. First Maccabees may have been written in Hebrew originally, but the version we have is in Greek. The only version we have an example of is in Greek. Second Maccabees most likely was only written in Greek. And that is an emblem of how Hellenized the Maccabees had become. By the time they were writing these histories, they're writing them in Greek. Well, the rabbis did not include any books in Greek in their canon when they decided what books were in the Hebrew Bible. They knew there were other books out there. They refer to other books sometimes that are beyond the canon that have survived elsewhere. The book of Ben Sira, for example, appears in the Catholic Bible as the Ecclesiasticus or the Wisdom of Sirach. The rabbis refer to it and even quote from it occasionally. So they knew it existed, but they didn't include it in their book, and they didn't include the Maccabees in their book. Look, they refer to the Hasmoneans rebelling in that passage in the Talmud that we saw, but not with all the detail that we have in the books of Maccabees. So they were aware of the story on some level, but it didn't get included in the Hebrew canon. It was preserved in the Catholic canon because the Catholics took the Jewish Bible in Greek that pre-existed Jesus and made it their Old Testament. And that Jewish Bible in Greek that pre-existed Jesus is called the Septuagint. The Septuagint includes those books, and so the Catholics took it with them. Thank goodness, because they preserved ancient Jewish literature that the rabbis would not have saved. So we owe the Catholic Church a thank you. Well, on the net, they still owe us quite a bit, but on that one detail, we owe them a thank you for having preserved that book. But by the later Middle Ages, Jews were learning other languages. They had learned Greek or Latin, and they were actually helping to translate stuff from Arabic back into European languages. So they could read these books that the Catholic Church had, and they recognized these characters and these stories as theirs. So it's not that they were unaware of this. They were aware of these stories and this literature. It just didn't become part of their canon directly.